Hi, and welcome back to Made to Walk. Today we are going to be walking through political crisis management. I haven't done a political training in a minute, so I thought that I would dive into this one. I just recently did it for a precinct chair training, and I thought it would be helpful to you. If you're new to Made to Walk, you may not know, but we use something called pre-mortem thinking. And if you've never heard of pre-mortem thinking, it is essentially predicting conflict, which means thinking about everything that could possibly go wrong and then solving for those things backwards. So again, it's thinking about everything that could possibly go awry and then thinking about ways to solve them so that when we are in times of conflict, that we learn to be responsive and not reactive. Because when we don't expect conflict, we tend to fall into fight or flight. And in fight or flight, we tend to be very emotional. And in our emotional responses, we tend to make errors. So we try to steer away from that. And the way that we do that is using communication skills. So we want to be able to connect with people well. And that comes from active listening. Now, inside in-party conflict, you might look at some of the topics we're going to go over and think, well, isn't that a fight that we would have with the opposition? And actually, that's incorrect. We deal with a lot of in-party conflict on specific matters. We may believe the same practical things, but maybe we struggle with what is the best road to get there. And then we may actively be looking at whether or not this is a fundamental of the platform that we need to be discussing. There's a lot of things that could be in conflict: financial responsibility, transparency, many other things. So this is a good just go around if you are thinking about being part of an organization, how to go about learning how to discuss some of these matters. So let's look at my 6 top agenda items, one of them being meetings. So oftentimes I hear people say, keep the peace and just do what you can to work well with others. And actually keeping the peace is not keeping the peace. Unfortunately, the reality is that when we don't raise a concern when it happens, then we tend to bring up those concerns later, and they'll come out in context like, well, I would have said this in the meeting, but, or maybe you say, I was thinking that, but I never said it. And so it becomes this open door for conflict of, why didn't you say something if you knew it was an issue? Or why didn't you raise a concern in there? I would have liked to have known that information. And so it still creates conflict. It actually just creates like a gossipy conflict, as opposed to just being clear and open in a meeting and raising concern in real time so that you can address the matters and find resolution quickly. On a lateral engagement, we want to be considerate of the position that we're in. So sometimes when we step up into a higher position, we start to talk to people underneath us as being, lower than us. And sometimes we look above us as an opportunity. That's a place I'd like to go. And so you start to aim your decision making in trajectory to one of these things. You're either trying to be higher than you are, or you're trying to domineer over those underneath you. And where the real waves, the real impact happens is on that lateral movement. And so if you are making impact in the role that you're in, that's what actually creates an environment for you to be a leader, because others beneath you are looking at you and saying, wow, what an inspiration. I'd love to be as impactful as you are. And those above you are looking at you and saying, wow, you're really great at the position that you're in. I'd love to see you up here in my cabinet. So you really need to be focused on your lateral engagement and finding ways to impact your community from a lateral standpoint. The GOP data center is something that we use for analysis, and getting that information about the demographics that you are engaging with isn't just for curiosity. It is for an opportunity for you to find ways to connect with people on a level that they find to be the best way to communicate. So if you find that the demographic within your precinct is primarily from millennials, or you find that they're majority female, or whatever it is, the demographic that you have a really good outline of how to construct your language, knowing exactly who you're talking to. And so these different formulations of communication can be generational. So if you're talking to someone in a Gen X or higher generation, they may prefer to have things handwritten and mailed to them like they would find to be very respectable. Where if you're talking to a millennial, Millennials tend to be more converse engaged, so they want to have those conversations. So door knocking would be impactful, although, making sure that you are in a position where you are well seen and that you're not coming up to the door like a shady individual, because they tend to be more skeptical than other generations. However, having those conversations are important because they like to be heard. And then anything beneath that, so your Gen Zers are going to want to just receive a text message. Please don't call me. Please don't talk to me. Please don't send me anything in the mail. I will never read it. I will never open it. I will never engage with it. That's going to be how you connect with them. So, each of these generations are going to have these impactful things that are very important for us to take into consideration when communicating. Communicating gratitude is also vital, because gratitude is the number one thing that you can do to keep retention. So if you have volunteers, or if you're working in a particular precinct and you see other precinct chairs who are doing well, instead of being critical about what the EC isn't doing, or being critical about what this organization or that organization is or isn't doing, find someone who is doing something, and then lean into that and say, wow, I really noticed that you are going above and beyond in this. I just want you to know I see you, and I am so grateful that you're here in association to our party and that you're making great impact. Making sure that our arguments are concrete is also vital. So if you are in the middle of a conflict and you would like to engage, but the first notion that you kind of are pulling from is a feeling without any concrete arguments, you're going to want to take a breath and take a step back. I always say to look for chapter and verse. So essentially that's going to be, your bylaws, your constitution, your SRIC rules, those things. Go back and actually learn the language. Be able to bring that as a factual backing to your argument. Make sure that your statements are concrete, that they're not coming from a subjective place of emotion. And then everything that we do needs to be checked with our motives. So we're doing what we're doing because we want to inspire others in our actions. So if you've been in politics for too long, you can go from being in a position where you originally intended to be very community driven and thinking of others. And then the motives of our decision making tend to shift. Like, is this a good look for me? Is this a good partnership? What am I going to gain from this? Is this going to help with my reelection campaign? And so our motives can tend to shift just naturally from being there too long. So when we're doing things, we have to keep ourselves in check. Am I doing this to inspire others? Am I doing this to impact others? Or do I have a personal motive? And we'll talk a little bit more about motives here in a minute. When it comes to your party structure, you want to make sure that you understand who your partners in the process are. You're not on an island alone. And I think sometimes as a volunteer or a precinct chair, you can tend to think that you are not connected to the full structure of how things function. And the reality is that you may just not know who is in the position to handle what and where to go for what. So this is just a really great example. And I think where some of the murkiness really tends to fall is in that CEC section. And if you notice, the CEC committee is in one grouping. So your CEC, your county chair is not over the precinct chairs. It is an adjacent to. They are working together collaboratively. So don't be afraid to do things like raise a motion or point of information. Don't feel like you are not an authority. You are an authority. It's a collaborative effort, and it's important that you learn to understand your position and not overstep your power. It's not about being divisive or about being objective all the time, but it is about making it well known that there isn't any one person over any one thing. It's just a way in which we conduct business to work collaboratively together. And when we want to connect, we want to be active listeners. And these are three really great framing rules that I have. Listen without the intent to respond. So we are not thinking about our argument. We are actually responding only to what the other person is saying. That's rule number 2, because it's important when we start to get into some of these topical issues that we are addressing things from a perspective and from an opportunity that is open to discussing it the way the other person wants to discuss it, not the way that we want to discuss it. And I'll get into some examples here in just a moment. And you want to mirror back what others have said. So think of it kind of like echoing If someone has made a statement, if someone's making an argument or is bringing forth a theory, you want to in some way incorporate that into your response so that they know that you're active listening. Let's look at the 5 rules of effective communication. Decide in advance what you want to accomplish. So again, that's different than motives and agenda. Just having an argument is one thing, but knowing what you're trying to accomplish is another. So oftentimes I'll have a client say, well, we need to go after this person because they did this. And I have to ask, like, do we want to win this fight? And what does it mean if we do? And if we win this other partnership or this organization, can we take on that load? Is that something that we really want to put a claim to at this moment? So we kind of have to flush that through some pre-mortem thinking. These are some of the things that could come from winning. These are some things that could come from losing. Is this really what we want to accomplish? Say only what you need to say and nothing else. Don't ask questions that don't have actual answers. Don't use blame, criticism, accusations, punishment, or humiliation. So oftentimes in politics, we tend to be very critical of someone's score or just history with things. And it's important that you understand there's a difference between placing facts and saying these are the facts. And this is the outline of the reality in which we're living in. And we dislike the way that you are doing things. And the difference between like taunting and criticism, which is very different. It's a personal attack on the individual that is separate from the work in which they do. And so we need to have the balance of understanding what it means to argue the facts as opposed to criticizing through personal gain. Always be ready to stop when things get too heated. So if you are in the process of discussing something either with a co-partner or just someone who's just within the party, it could be a friend, could be a family member. If you're going round and round about an argument and you feel like it's about to get to the point where someone's going to say something they're going to regret, it's okay to say, I really respect your opinion. I just feel like we need to take a breath. What you don't want to do is remove yourself from the situation in a way that actually escalates it by just getting up and removing yourself or being very dismissive about it. Then you'll get some kind of rhetoric that will sound simply as, well, see, this is why I don't have conversations with you, or see, this is why, I don't try to reason with you. You always want to make it known that I'm walking away because I do care. Because I care about you, because I don't want to say anything that would be hurtful to you, or I feel like you're going to hurt me and it's going to hurt a relationship, I'm going to step away. That's the best way to approach the communication. Now, moving into the actual formulation of the argument, we want to stay away from subjective arguments. And I tend to hear Christians get into this mess probably more so than anybody else. And it comes from a place where I think it's maybe insecurity that we don't know necessarily how to formulate our arguments outside of, well, because I said so, because God said so, because the Bible said so. You have to remember that sometimes you're dealing with people who don't always believe the same things as you do or have the same upbringing or worldview, and we'll go into a long laundry list of things that make us different as individuals, just our life experiences, really. But we want to base our arguments off of facts instead of emotions so that it's easier for us to state what we believe. And so I often use abortion as an example, not just because it's, the number one talking point when it comes to the GOP oftentimes, but because there's different formulations to the argument. And what tends to happen is I always hear our side only argue one point. But I hear the other side argue it many different ways. And it's just because we're not active listening and responding to what we're hearing. So I might hear a girl say, well, I believe that abortion is healthcare, and I believe it's between her and her doctor. And what I would argue is, if that's true, and I believe that you believe that, then your doctor should probably disclose to you that post-abortion syndrome is, something that does occur, and it's the same DSM-5 rating as PTSD. And it comes with all the same side effects as PTSD. And so don't you think it's your doctor's responsibility to disclose that? Because I do care about a woman's mental health, and I do care about her health care. And in the same concept, if your body is going through PTSD, that's a formulation of response to trauma. So if our body is responding as if you've gone through a traumatic incident, then is it safe and good for the body to go through an abortion? And I think when you are keeping it to that. And you notice that I don't swing it back around to, is it a baby or is it not a baby? Does the baby have rights? Because that's not the argument they're making. Now, I'll fast forward to another one. Now, I'm going to show you how to frame these large logical arguments. A statement of belief is just essentially like, whatever their belief system is. And so I'm using the example of I am pro-choice. So their argument would sound something like, I am pro-choice because I believe it is my body and my choice, right? It's a very common one. So my argument back would be, I believe that you believe your belief. However, I do not believe your party supports your belief. And they'll look at you very puzzled because you're not jumping to rhetoric and you're not jumping to a subjective argument. And so when you have the opportunity to place your statement in adjacent to your argument, it would be a conditional statement. So a conditional statement has an if and a then. So it would sound something like, if it is your body and your choice, then why does your party pass laws such as Bloomberg's 2013 fine that implemented a consequence more than double that of possession of marijuana simply for purchasing an extra large Coke? If I want to drink an extra large Coke and fries, should it not then be my body's choice to get diabetes if it's not in its best interest? Isn't that the same as a pro-life argument? So we have to make them think, right? We're not saying you're wrong or you're an idiot or you're this or you're that. We're not also saying subjective arguments of going back to our original argument that has nothing to do with the frame of which we are, the topic of which we're discussing. We have to be able to respond to what is being addressed. And so working that muscle and understanding the different arguments and how to respond to the different arguments are the best way to approach these things. And again, I hear these things in party. They're not just opposition. So if you talk another one might be, is the wall necessary? Is it within the budget? Does it work? Is it really an issue, down there at the border? Is this, just something that we hear about in the news, but it's more, exaggerated than it is? And I actually went through this one in my last training with some precinct chairs, and you'll be surprised how many people will immediately jump to a subjective argument. And they'll say, well, the wall's important because it keeps bad people out. And I say, well, bad is subjective. And they say, well, keeping people that I don't want in my house, just like, having a front door that's locked. Well, people you don't want in your house may be different than people that I want in my house. It's still a subjective argument. And finally, after a couple rounds of going back and forth, somebody said terrorists. And I said, there you go. That's a non-subjective argument. You're saying, I specifically am trying to keep out terrorists. Why? Because terrorists have an agenda to harm America, and they have an agenda to harm, potentially my life, my children's lives. It's not something that's an if and or maybe. It is something that is genuinely happening and I'm concerned about. And we can both agree that terrorism is wrong, correct? So that's a great argument to that specific point because it is defined. It is not broad. And so we want to keep away from broad arguments. I recently got hammered online for showing the movie D-Trans that was essentially a documentary of testimony placed by individuals who were young and made the decision to transition and then made the decision to transition back because of the harm that they didn't really understand would come from the decisions that they were making. And, we're continuing to process what needs to be disclosed in order for you to have these kinds of really destructive surgeries to a young child. And somebody went and blasted me, a leader from the opposition went and blasted me about how dare I show this in Smith County and how dare I show this here in Tyler, and was just going on and on and on. And I understood the argument because I had studied the argument of the LGBTQ plus community, which is that you are denying me my experience. So I immediately went on and responded to him. And all I said is, are you denying the experiences of those giving the testimony in the documentary? I didn't argue why I should play the movie. I didn't argue his opinion about the movie. I was simply saying, you're denying their right to tell their story and to share their story about their experiences And immediately the comment stopped. You see, you have to find a way to not just shield yourself away from the opposition. I think a lot of times it's like, oh, I don't even listen to that. It's trash. Or I don't even listen to what they say. You got to listen to what they say, because when you listen to how they argue, you'll know how to argue back. So it's important for us to be involved in that conversation. We also don't want to react in our mind when we're having these oppositions, because our body will carry body language that is a result of what we are thinking. So if I'm thinking like, this person is crazy, then my body is going to start to do things that make the person feel like I'm being dismissive. I'm not engaged in the conversation. I'm not actually listening. And that's what you're going to hear. You're going to say, oh, you're not even listening. You're not even taking me seriously. You're not even listening to what I have to say. And truth of the matter is, you're probably not. So it's important to kind of put a mantra in your mind in those particular moments, like, I can listen, but I don't have to believe. I can listen, but I don't have to believe. Something that you can just kind of repeat in your head, that will kind of keep everything else in your body calm, so that you can focus on listening. Okay, so this is an interesting little game, if you will, that I have that goes with the theory that I focus on. And I talk about developing the muscle to construct communication that involves empathy. Empathy is important. Empathy is not sympathy. And I think that gets really confused sometimes. Empathy is being able to understand, hear, and formulate a bigger picture from other people's life experiences. And so what I do is and if you have a precinct and you want to do this, I highly recommend it. I do it with adults all the time, although it's going to sound like something you would do with 3-year-olds. But I create 2 plastic bins, and in them I put kinetic sand. I put 2 different colors of kinetic sand in each one. And then I go ahead and I put different things in one. Like I put rocks and in one, and gems in one. And then on the other one, I might put animals in one, and this, that, whatever. And so not real animals, fake animals. But then I put a towel over it, and I have each group go in and put their hands in it. And I say, you're gonna think about what you feel, but you don't say anything yet. And so once everyone is done and they sit down and I take the boxes away, I say, what is it that you felt? And so they have to discuss it with each other. And so one person will say, I think I felt this. Oh, is that what that was? I was wondering what that was. That makes more sense now based off of what I felt. And every once in a while, someone will get some of the kinetic sand underneath their nails. And so they'll say, well, it's something green. Well, how do you know that? Because there's green under my nails. Oh, okay, so you have a fact. You have a fact that you are contributing to the conversation. And so they put all of the pieces together and they formulate an idea of what they think happened, or what they think is being expressed or defined, if you will. And so then I pull off the towel and they look inside and they're like, oh, that's not what I thought it looked like at all. Or they got pretty close, but not quite there. And so I say, could you see it? Could you see the whole picture when you put your hands in there? And the answer is usually always no. Like, could you see the color? Could you see how it smelled? Could you see what it looked like? No, you can't. You can only go based off of the small piece of information that you have. And you were able to see a bigger part of the picture by listening to other people's sides of the story and understanding their view. But you still couldn't grasp the whole picture. So when someone tells you how they feel, what we don't want to respond is, you're wrong. Because they may have a truth to how they feel, they just don't see the full picture. And so they're confusing what they're feeling as being their truth, but in reality, it's just a part of the story. And so I'm not denying that maybe is your experience. I often deal with this when I'm training people that are dealing with people who've gone through church hurt. I'm not denying that you were probably at a church where, bad things happened, or you got to witness, corruption from leadership or whatever it was. I'm not denying that that's the truth. I'm not saying, oh, churches don't do that. But what I am saying is that that's not how church was originally defined and created to function. And it's important that we create safe environments and function by doing better and by pushing for better. Right. And so it's the same thing when we are discussing things with people who have just a different form of thought on an opinion or a topic matter or a legislative priority, maybe just even a solution to something that we agree on. I hear it all the time with abortion. It's like we all agree abortion's bad, but there's a lot of argument about what to do about it and how far to prosecute it. And so these are ways that you can learn to have these conversations with taking in empathy and trying to understand. Like I always, I heard a man that was like completely irate and was saying that like women who choose to have an abortion should be arrested. And he was irate about it. I mean, like there was passion. And this woman that was sitting next to me, she was so offended. She was just like, that is so unrealistic. And like, what about the man in the situation? And I just like put my hand on her knee and I just said, I don't know his story. But if I had to guess, I would think that someone aborted a baby that he wanted to keep. And that's his experience. And this is a response to his experience. Now, is it the right response? Is it the best response? You know, these are subjective ways that we can argue about this viewpoint, but a lot of times these kinds of responses come from an actual worldview that's been developed because of a trauma or because of a real life experience. And so I can have empathy to it. I don't have to agree to it. I don't have to submit to it or get behind it, but I can have empathy for it. And so that's how we formulate these kinds of conversations. One way that we don't do that is by being social media warriors. So a lot of times people jump onto social media and their first thought when they see someone with an opposition is to just jump down their throats about how naive they are or how disconnected they are with this, that, whatever. And my recommendation is always like, take that person to lunch, like take that person to coffee and ask them like, I'd love to know how you got there. I'd love to know how it is that you got to this point that you are having this viewpoint. And you might learn something about them. At very least, you're going to get their view of experience. And then you can talk about constructive ways to be helpful in particular, whatever it is that you're discussing or arguing. But you can do it by being constructive in doing it face to face and having, intentional listening. In cultural moral codes, this is where things tend to get heated, especially in today's culture. Now, I hear cultural wars be thrown around a lot. I hear cultural wars be almost the frame of mind of how we are kind of differentiating us between those that are in academia. But it's actually very ignorant because academia doesn't understand like what they do. This is the way I kind of see it. It's like they took a class and heard like one thing and they were like, that's the thing. That's the thing I want to get behind. That's the thing I want to argue. And the truth of the matter is I'm like, I don't think you really understand what that means. So they kind of get behind this like cultural relativism, although it's not cultural relativism because they want to protect other people's cultures. But in order to do that, you actually can't critique your own either. So they tend to be the same people who say like, oh, well, that's offensive, or, that's this or that. You can't do that with someone else's culture. But at the same time, they'll be like, America's racist or America's an unsafe place to live. And in reality, I'm kind of just sitting there as in like, so you obviously don't understand how that works, this cultural relativism. You really don't grasp that you can't argue about your own culture either. And so we tend to see that people will get very constructive about making arguments that affect other people but don't affect them. And they take on this war. And so they tend to make decisions for people that they can't see, that they're not face to face with. And so I would, be very careful because I love the First Amendment. So I love when people disagree with me. Like I'm not offended by it at all. I'm like, that is the best thing about our country is that we have the First Amendment and you can disagree with me. But what I'm not going to do is I'm not going to jump out and I'm not going to hang myself on a topic that I can't relate to. So if it's not something I've experienced or that I have personal experience with, I really find it difficult to get into the argument about, because I don't feel like I have something to, that would be helpful. And I see this from the opposition. Oftentimes they get into these fights for people that they're like, I'm trying to help you. And they're like, please stop. You're not helping, And what we tend to see that come based out of is that they're looking at other people's life experiences and trauma and worldview and education, access and egoism and ethical subjectivism. And they're kind of formulating their own picture, but they don't get the full picture because they're not having the conversations with people on a face-to-face level. They're not asking them about that. I just had this conversation about the difference between the culture of the West and the culture of the East. And it essentially formulates to the culture of the West is thinking about, how does this make me feel? Well, then that's where you get into the moral codes of ethical subjectivism, which is everything I do is based on my own feelings, even if that thing I do benefits another person. So essentially, you are doing nice things for other people because it makes you feel good. However, it's not really about them. It's about how it makes you feel. And this is what I see more so today than anything. And I could get into the many, many theories, but I would have to have 3 hours on each one. But you can get into, just simple subjectivism and emotivism. The one I'm going to focus on right now, though, is motives. And I talked about this a little bit earlier, but motives are a very interesting concept because they affect politics so much. Everything that we do has motives. And sometimes those motives are truly genuine, but also it can be like an 80% genuine, and then there's a small portion of you that has a motive. And I give the example of if you see someone broken down on the side of the road, and most men, if you have a truck and you see a woman broken down on the side of the road with a kid or something, your instinct is to pull over and to help, right? And so there's a huge part of you, 80% of you, that's like, I'm doing it because I genuinely care. And then there is a small portion of you that is like, if I keep driving and I see this person on the 6 o'clock news tonight that they were hurt or injured in any way because I left them on the side of the road, I'm going to feel guilty. So because I don't want to feel guilty, because I don't want to have guilt, I'm going to do this nice thing. And that's a reality. And we often have to check our motives about what we're doing. Are we doing something because it genuinely benefits other people, or we're doing it because it makes us feel good? And I see this through and through and through from the millennials down, making decisions that impact the way we feel, because how we feel is the most important thing here in the West. Because we are not consumed with an ideology anymore. A lot of people are not connected in their faith. If they do go to church, they go to church. It's like going to a country club. They're not actually connected in their faith. They're not actually connected and surrendered to their ideology, where you would see a lot of that in the East. You would see a lot of that with the Muslim faith and many other faiths, that really it's about the community as a whole, the faith as a whole. And so it becomes very difficult in America to check our personal motives when we're not doing it for something higher or bigger than ourselves. We're just thinking about what we want in that moment or what makes us feel good. In the strategy of how to combat this movement that comes with just deconstruction, right? Just picking the things that make me feel great. And that can be within our own party platform. That can be within the faith of the Bible, just picking stuff that makes us feel good, nothing that makes us feel, conviction or makes us feel like that's going to be a lot of work, or I don't know if I want to take on that fight. So let's just do what's easy. We tend to look at this from a cultural aspect and how it's going to evolve, what the trajectory is going to be. So you do that by analyzing the data, predicting cultural and generational shifts, creating engagement solutions, and then you build and you narrate what those solutions are so that you are communicating with transparency to say, hey, this is what's coming. And this is why we're implementing these task force or these engagement priorities, because we see the trajectory and it's not good. We want to set long-term goals for demographic engagement, and then we want to inspire a next generation. And I think that this is something that has failed from the last couple of generations, is that we have done things to preserve in a beautiful way. And we have shown what a good fight looks like in a beautiful way. But bringing in the next generation to make sure that they are going to be able to take that strong conviction into the next generation has been something that we just have not been hyper focused on. For whatever reason, whether you thought that millennials were a lost cause or that they didn't get it or whatever it is, they're here and they've got kids and their kids are having kids now. So it's really important for us to find ways to connect with the next generation. And so people will ask me, so how do we connect with Gen Z? And I'm like, oh, you missed the buck on that. We're already focused on alpha, because we look at the 20-year trajectory. We don't look at, just what's coming up in the next 2 years. We would have had to have in some way been involved in that atmosphere way before now in order to get into that conversation. So you have to kind of think about that on the horizon. Creating small groups is a great way for you to have these natural conversations that produce really effective and great communication, to understand your community and to be able to discuss matters in a constructive way where we actively are listening. When I created the workbook, Biblical Crisis Management, I didn't create it for people to do it on their own. I created it for people to do with other people, because I believe that accountability is the huge thing that we've taken away from people. With this My Truth movement and me culture, there isn't accountability and there isn't someone pushing you along to get you to the next level of growth. And I think that we can do that through sharing an openness, but also by pulling people up when they are in the pit, when they're in a difficult season in their life. And so, if you're a precinct chair, I think that all precinct chairs should have some small group. And it doesn't have to necessarily be a biblical class, but just a time of fellowship and discussion to talk about the concerns of the nation, the concerns of their community, to raise awareness and connect and try to get on the same page about how to converse about some of these matters can be hugely effective to the trajectory of a community. So I hope that this was helpful for you if you are a in-party leader. And I genuinely get to enjoy making these. And so if there is a particular subject matter I haven't hit on, you can always go to madetowalk.org and submit a request for a specific topic. Until then, thank you guys so much for tuning in, and I look forward to doing more with you.